In a disused hall a whole kingdom away, she laid her hand on the frozen throne no one had dared to touch in 500 years. And in the twilight lands of Nocturne, the Shadow King opened his eyes. Linnea was an archivist, a creature of dust and parchment, as overlooked as the forgotten histories she kept. Weeks before the Crown Prince had held up her masterwork, a survey of the northern territories, for the whole court to ridicule, calling it fantasy. But Linnea's maps showed what no one wanted to see. Rivers and dry beds, forests and barren lands, the forgotten passes into the blighted reaches of Nocturne, drawn with impossible clarity. Her hands did not only trace coastlines, they felt the memory of the world, the deep veins of something ancient sleeping beneath the soil. So when those hands touched the onyx throne that kings had feared for 5 centuries, she did not feel dead stone. She felt something that still beat, in a kingdom away. Something answered. No one had dared lay a hand on that throne in 500 years. She did. And in lands no light had touched in a century, the vampire king of Nocturne, who had slept through the fall of empires, woke and turned toward the one hand that had ever reached him. If you believe the one no one noticed can do what no king dared, type dared below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the maps. Linnea's life was lived on paper. She was a cartographer of uncommon skill, her fingers able to trace not just coastlines and borders, but the fainter, more ancient lines of the world, the deep veins of magic that slumbered beneath the soil. But her gift was her curse. Weeks before, she had presented her masterwork to the royal court, a new survey of the kingdom's northern territories. It was beautiful, intricate, illuminated with gold leaf and crushed lapis. But it was also, in the eyes of the crown prince, fantasy. It showed rivers where there were now dry beds, forests and lands long barren, and it detailed the forgotten mountain passes into the blighted lands of Nocturne with a startling, impossible clarity. Prince Alaric, a man whose vanity was matched only by his ignorance, had held it up for the court to ridicule. He had pointed a gloved finger at her careful work. "The fanciful scribblings of a spinster," he declared, his voice ringing with derision. "Perhaps Mistress Linnea has spent too long with her fairy tales and forgotten the shape of the real world." Laughter, sharp and cruel, had echoed in the grand hall. Linnea had felt herself shrink, the heat of shame crawling up her neck. She had taken her map, her soul laid bare on vellum, and retreated to the silence of her archives. The wound was deep. It wasn't just his dismissal of her work. It was the dismissal of her, of the very truth she felt in her bones. The world had told her she was small and wrong, and she had started to believe it. That was why she found herself in the Hall of Echoes that night. It was a cavernous, cold space the castle had forgotten, home only to dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight and the onyx throne. It sat on its dais like a shard of frozen night, carved from a single piece of obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the air. Legend said it was freezing to the touch, and that its cold could stop a man's heart. Linnea wasn't seeking death. She was seeking proof. She carried a flickering candle, its small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The base of the throne was etched with carvings, and as she drew closer, her breath caught. It was a map, an ancient, star-based map of the continent as it had been millennia ago. And there, etched into the dark stone, were the same rivers, the same forests, the same ley lines she had drawn. The truth she had felt was carved into the heart of this ancient, terrible thing. She felt a wave of validation so fierce it almost brought her to her knees. She wasn't wrong. He was. The world was. Without thinking, driven by a need to connect with this silent, solitary witness to her truth, she reached out. Her fingers, calloused from quills and knives, brushed against the armrest. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. It was not the simple chill of stone, but an ancient, profound absence of heat, a cold that spoke of utter stillness and immense loneliness. But she didn't pull back. She held her ground against the biting frost and flattened her palm against the throne. She closed her eyes, pouring all her hurt, her frustration, and her quiet, defiant certainty into that single point of contact. "I see you," she thought, speaking not to a king, but to the land itself. "I know you are still there." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then beneath her palm, a flicker, a pulse of warmth, no stronger than a sleeping bird's breath, answered her. It was faint, ephemeral, but it was there. The ancient cold receded by a fraction of a degree. The candle flame beside her, which had been guttering in the throne's chilling aura, suddenly straightened and burned twice as bright. A kingdom away in a castle carved from a mountain of black ice, Lord Valerius's eyes snapped open, crimson in the gloom. For a century he had slept, a self-imposed torpor to wait out the slow, freezing death of his kingdom and his own soul. But now, a jolt, a feeling he hadn't known since his heart last beat. A touch, not on his skin, but on the very core of his being. A gentle, insistent warmth against an eternity of ice. Someone had touched the heart of his power, and it had answered. He rose from his stone sarcophagus, the shadows in the chamber swirling around him, coalescing, clinging to his form like a living cloak. He did not need to ask where the touch had come from. He could feel it, a tiny, flickering candle flame in a world of darkness. A beacon. A week passed. Linnea told no one. The moment at the throne felt like a dream, a secret she held tight in her chest. She threw herself back into her work, but something had shifted. The shame had lessened, replaced by a quiet, humming certainty. Then they arrived, the delegation from Nocturne. They rode through the capital city on horses as black as a starless night, their armor the color of dried blood, their faces pale and grim. They did not ask for an audience, they commanded it. At their head rode Lord Valerius himself. He was even more terrifying than the legends. Tall and impossibly still, he seemed to absorb the very light and sound around him. A palpable cold radiated from his presence, making courtiers shiver and candles flicker nervously. His face was a mask of aristocratic beauty, all sharp angles and pale marble. But his eyes were ancient and red, and they missed nothing. The court was in an uproar. King Theron and Prince Alaric met him in the throne room. Their throne room, which suddenly looked gaudy and weak in his presence. Valerius dismounted, his movements unnervingly fluid, silent. His shadows seemed to cling to the floor, moving with a volition of their own. He ignored the king's stammered greetings. He ignored Prince Alaric's arrogant posture. His crimson gaze swept the room, dismissing every lord and lady, every knight and counselor, as if they were furniture. Then his eyes stopped. They found her. Linnea was standing near the back by the archives entrance, where she had been summoned to fetch a treaty document. She was invisible, as always, but he saw her. Across the entire length of the grand hall, his gaze pinned her to the spot. It was not a look of anger or lust. It was a look of profound, unnerving recognition. It felt as if he were looking past her skin and bones and seeing the map of her soul. He moved. He did not walk so much as flow through the crowd, which parted before him like water before a ship's prow. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the impossible cold emanating from him and could smell the scent of ancient stone and winter frost. He was a mountain, she was a pebble at its base. He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he spoke, and his voice was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that vibrated in her bones. "You," he said. It was not a question. It was a final judgment. He turned his head slightly, addressing her king, but never taking his eyes off her. "I am here for her." King Theron sputtered. "The archivist? She is of no importance." Prince Alaric sneered. "My lord, surely you are mistaken. She is merely a scribe, a map-maker of little talent." A flicker of something dangerous crossed Valerius's face. The temperature in the hall dropped 10 degrees. "Her importance is not for you to determine," he stated, his voice now edged with steel. He laid out his terms with brutal simplicity. Her kingdom was being threatened by barbarian hordes from the east. He would deal with them. His armies would form a shield on their border. In exchange, he would take the archivist. Linnea. It was not a negotiation. It was a demand. King Theron, terrified and eager to be rid of a barbarian threat, agreed without a moment's hesitation. He sacrificed the unimportant archivist for the safety of his kingdom. Prince Alaric looked triumphant, as if he had just cleverly disposed of a nuisance. Linnea stood frozen, a pawn in a game she could not comprehend. This mythical king, this creature of nightmare, had crossed a continent for her. He looked back at her, and in his eyes she saw not a monster, but a man drowning in an endless winter. You are coming with me, he said, and it was a statement of fact, not a command. She looked from his intense, focused gaze to the sneering face of her prince, to the dismissive glance of her king. Here she was a fanciful spinster, a nobody. To this terrifying stranger, she was something, something worth crossing the world for. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her old life was over. The journey to Nocturne was a descent into twilight. The sun grew paler with each league they traveled north, the greens of the fields and forests leaching away into muted grays, blues, and deep purples. They rode through the whisperwood, where the trees were silver and leafless, their branches clawing at a sky the color of a bruise. There was no bird song, only the sighing of the wind and the muffled hoofbeats of their dark horses. Linnea rode beside Lord Valerius. He rarely spoke, content to exist in a profound, heavy silence. Yet she did not feel ignored. His attention was a constant, palpable thing, like the persistent cold that clung to him. His shadows danced at the edge of her vision, sometimes seeming to reach out and straighten her cloak when the wind grew too sharp. The guards, his crimson guard, were equally silent, moving with a disciplined grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. They treated her with a detached, formal respect that was more validating than any praise she had ever received at court. She was on a prisoner. A thick, fur-lined cloak had been provided for her, and she was given the gentlest of the black steeds. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would be free to leave. His castle, when they finally reached it, rose from the mountainside like a dragon's spine. It was a Gothic marvel of black stone and soaring towers that seemed to pierce the perpetually overcast sky. No torches lit its ramparts. Instead, a soft, ethereal light pulsed from veins of glowing crystal embedded in the walls, casting long, dancing shadows everywhere. Inside, the castle was not the grim, dusty tomb she might have expected. It was vast and silent, yes, but immaculately kept. The air was cold but clean, scented with beeswax and old paper. Her footsteps echoed on floors of polished obsidian that mirrored the vaulted, star-painted ceilings above. It was a place of immense age and deep, abiding melancholy. He led her not to a dungeon or even to chambers, but to a library. It was the most magnificent room she had ever seen. It was a cathedral of books, circular and impossibly tall, with shelves stretching up into the gloom, accessible by spiraling iron staircases. A huge, unlit fireplace dominated one wall, and in the center of the room sat a massive table of dark wood, its surface covered in star charts and half-finished maps. He finally broke his silence as he gestured to the room around them. "This is my kingdom, Linnea. Not the mountains or the forests. This, the knowledge of what it once was." He moved to stand before the cold hearth, the pulsing crystal light carving his profile from the darkness. "You felt it, didn't you? Through the throne. You felt the land." Linnea found her voice, surprised at how steady it was. "I felt a memory of life." "It is a dying memory," he said, his voice laced with a weariness that seemed older than the mountains. "Nocturne is freezing, not from a simple winter, but from its heart outward. The magic is fading, the lifeblood of the earth slowing to a stop. Soon there will be nothing but ice and silence." He turned to face her fully, his crimson eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "The onyx throne is a conduit, a link to the heart of this land. For centuries it has been dormant, severed from its home. No one could wake it. No one could even feel its slumber. Until you." Here it was, the revelation, the reason he had come for her. "The maps you drew," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "the ones for which you were mocked. They are not fantasy. They are the truth. You see the world not as it is, but as it was and as it should be. You see the ley lines, the veins of magic that I can no longer find. They have been broken, forgotten, buried under the weight of time and neglect." He took a step closer. The cold deepened. "I did not bring you here to be a bride or a hostage, Linnea. I brought you here because you are a cartographer, perhaps the last true one. I need you to map my kingdom, not its mountains and rivers, but its soul. I need you to find the broken lines, to trace the source of the decay. I need you to help me save my home from freezing into its own tomb." Linnea stared at him, her mind racing. All her life, her gift had been a source of quiet shame, a strange quirk that set her apart and made her a target for ridicule. Now, this ancient, powerful being was telling her it was not just real but essential, that it held the key to saving a kingdom. He wasn't praising her beauty or her wit. He was honoring her skill, her work, her very essence. She thought of Prince Alaric's sneering face, the fanciful scribblings of a spinster. She looked at Lord Valerius, at the vampire king who ruled a realm of shadows, and saw the raw, aching hope in his ancient eyes. He was offering her a chance to prove that everything she was, everything she had ever worked for, was true. "I will help you," she said, her voice clear and strong in the vast, silent library. It was a vow made not just to him, but to herself. Would you have agreed, knowing you were the only hope for a dying land ruled by a king of shadows? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Their work began the next day. The great table became their world. Valerius brought out scrolls and books bound in leather so old it had softened to silk. They were filled with the history of Nocturne, written in languages that had not been spoken for thousands of years. Languages Linnea found she could, with concentration, begin to understand, as if the knowledge was not in her mind, but in her blood. He was a patient teacher. He would stand behind her, his cool presence a steady weight, and point with a long, elegant finger to a passage, his voice a low murmur in her ear as he explained the ancient context. He never crowded her, never condescended. He treated her as a scholar, an equal. His respect was a balm on the old wound of her humiliation. Linnea, in turn, began to draw. She started with the existing maps of Nocturne, stark and simple things showing only rock and ice. But as she worked, her fingers tracing the outlines, she would close her eyes and feel. She would feel for the ghost of a river, the echo of a forest. Faintly at first, then with growing strength, the land began to speak to her. She would make a mark on the vellum, a tentative line in charcoal, and Valerius would watch, his stillness absolute. "There," she would whisper, her finger tapping the map. "There was a confluence here, a nexus of power. It feels dormant, blocked." And he would done a slow, grave movement. "Yes, the archives speak of the sunken city of Eridor. It was lost to an earthquake 2 millennia ago. No one has known its location since." He saw her. He didn't just see the quiet woman the world overlooked. He saw the intricate, powerful mind, the sensitive soul. He began to notice the small things, the way she would bite her lower lip when a line was proving difficult to sense, the determined set of her jaw, the way a stray curl of her simple brown hair would fall across her cheek, and how she would impatiently tuck it back, leaving a faint smudge of charcoal on her skin. One evening, as the crystal light outside bathed the library in a soft violet glow, she shivered. The castle's chill had finally seeped into her bones. Before she could think to grab her cloak, something soft and heavy settled over her shoulders. It was his own cloak, the one of shadow and night. It carried his scent of frost and old stone, but wrapped around her, it felt impossibly warm, radiating a gentle heat. She looked up and saw him standing several feet away, by a bookshelf, pretending to be examining a spine. His shadows, however, had done the work, lifting the cloak and settling it around her. It was the first act of overt, personal care. A small thing, but it resonated deeply in the quiet between them. "Thank you," she said softly. He merely inclined his head, his face unreadable in the gloom, but she felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a lessening of the ancient cold. The days bled into weeks. The map grew, becoming a tapestry of what was and what could be. Linnea worked tirelessly, fueled by a purpose she had never known. She grew accustomed to his presence, to the silent company, and the dancing shadows that seemed to have accepted her. They would move a fallen quill back into her reach, or turn the page of a heavy book when she was cross-referencing. They were his familiars, extensions of his will, and they were gentle with her. She, in turn, began to see past the fearsome legend of the Shadow King. She saw the profound loneliness in him, the immense burden of his stewardship. He was bound to his dying land, its slow demise a reflection of his own frozen heart. He was a king in a silent, empty castle, with no one but ghosts and shadows for company. One night she found him not in the library, but in a high gallery overlooking a valley of black, needle-like pines. A fire, the first she had seen in the Nocturne, woost in a great stone hearth, casting flickering orange light on his pale features. He stared into the flames, but his crimson eyes were not seeing the fire. They were seeing centuries of loss. She came to stand beside him, a respectful distance away. For a long time they stood in silence, watching the flames. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. It must be lonely. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his reality. He turned his head slowly to look at her. The surprise in his eyes was stark. No one had ever offered him empathy. They offered him fear or supplication or hatred. Never simple human compassion. Loneliness is the price of eternity, he said, his voice rough, as if unused to such a topic. Perhaps, she countered gently, or perhaps it is just a habit. A strange, small smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that transformed his face, making him look younger, less formidable. You are not afraid of me, are you, Linnea? No, she said, and was surprised to find it was the absolute truth. I think I was more afraid of the laughing faces in the throne room. His expression hardened for a moment, the memory of her humiliation stirring his ancient anger. Then it softened. They were fools, blind. They saw what they expected to see, she said. A plain, quiet woman with fanciful ideas. I see a fire that could warm a dying world, he stated, his voice a low rumble. I see the architect of my kingdom's future. The intensity of his words, the sheer, unvarnished value he placed on her, stole her breath. In that moment by the fire, something shifted irrevocably between them. The polite distance of colleagues dissolved, leaving behind a fragile, tentative connection as bright and warm as the fire in the hearth. The breakthrough on the map came a week later. She had been working late, tracing a complex network of lines near the northernmost mountain range, the Dragon's Teeth. She was exhausted, her head aching with the effort of concentration. She must have drifted off, her head pillowed on her arms, her hands still resting on the vellum. In her dream, she felt a touch, a coolness that should have been jarring, but was instead soothing, like a cold cloth on a fevered brow. It was a gentle pressure against her fingers, a silent presence acknowledging her work, her exhaustion. She sighed in her sleep, a soft, contented sound, and her fingers curled slightly, leaning into the touch. Valerius stood over her, his heart so long still, thrumming with a strange, forgotten rhythm. He had come to see her progress and found her asleep. He had watched her for a long time, the moonlight from the high windows silvering her hair. He had seen the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes and felt an unfamiliar urge, the urge to protect, to soothe. He had reached out, his own instincts surprising him, and his cold fingers had brushed against hers where they lay on the map. He had expected her to flinch, to pull away even in sleep. But she hadn't. She had leaned into his touch, into his cold, as if it were a comfort. A current, a jolt of impossible warmth had shot up his arm, a feeling so alien and so powerful it made him gasp. It was her warmth, her life, her acceptance, and it was a feeling he suddenly knew he could not live without again. He drew his hand back as if burned, but the sensation lingered. He looked at her, so small and fragile against the vastness of his library and his world, and knew she was the strongest thing in it. He let his shadow detach from the floor, a pool of deeper darkness, and commanded it to move. It flowed over her shoulders, settling like a soft woolen blanket, shielding her from the castle's chill. For the first time in centuries, the Shadow King felt not like a warden of a tomb, but a guardian of a precious, flickering light. Their work had pinpointed the heart of the decay, a cavern deep beneath the Dragon's Teeth Mountains, where the main ley line, the kingdom's aorta, had been magically shattered and frozen. The map was nearly complete. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, had begun to take root in the castle's cold halls. It was then that the outside world intruded. Prince Alaric had not been idle. Consumed by jealousy and a furious, bruised ego, he could not accept that the unimportant archivist was now the key to the Shadow King's domain. He convinced himself that Linnea was not a scholar, but a vessel of some power that Valerius was exploiting, a power he believed rightfully belonged to his kingdom, a power he wanted to control. Gathering a small, elite retinue of knights, he led a fool's crusade into Nocturne. They crossed the border under the cover of a magically induced fog, their arrogance blinding them to the fact that in this land, every shadow had eyes. Valerius knew the moment they set foot in his domain. He was in the library with Linnea when he went utterly still, his head lifting as if listening to a distant sound. The air crackled with power. The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into menacing forms. "What is it?" Linnea asked, a sense of dread creeping over her. His crimson eyes met hers, and they were no longer the eyes of a melancholy scholar. They were the flat, predatory eyes of a creature ancient and without mercy. "Your prince has come to reclaim you." A cold fury washed through him, so potent it made the very stones of the castle vibrate. The sheer audacity, the violation. This strutting fool who had cast her aside like rubbish now dared to enter his home to steal her back, to harm her. "I will deal with this," he said, his voice a low growl. He turned to leave, the shadows flowing around him, forming a maelstrom of darkness. But Linnea stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. He stopped, surprised. "Linnea, this is not a debate for the court. This is a matter of annihilation." "He humiliated me," she said, her chin lifted. "He made my life's work a joke. This is my fight too. I will not hide in your library while you protect me. I will stand with you." He looked down at her fierce, determined face. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a queen defending her new home. His partner. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen that night by the hearth. The fire that was slowly thawing his world. A fierce, possessive pride surged through him. He gave a slow, dangerous smile. "Very well, my lady cartographer. Let us go greet your prince." They met Alaric and his knights in the castle's outer courtyard. The prince, seeing Linnea beside Valerius, looked triumphant. "There you are. We have come to rescue you from this monster." Linnea stepped forward, Valerius a silent, terrifying statue of vengeance at her back. The full force of his power was coiled, held in check, but the knights could feel it. Their horses shifted nervously, their eyes rolling in fear. The very air was heavy, charged with imminent violence. "I did not need rescuing, Alaric," Linnea said, her voice ringing with a confidence she had never possessed before. It echoed in the courtyard, sharp and clear. "I was discarded, remember?" Alaric's face flushed with anger. "Do not be a fool. You are a subject of my kingdom. You will return with me." "No," she said simply. "This is my home now. The work I do here is real. The fanciful scribblings you mocked are healing a dying land, a land that is real and that is suffering because of the ignorance and arrogance of men like you." She took another step forward, her gaze unflinching. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Her words, spoken by the woman he had dismissed so easily, were a greater blow than any sword. To be so thoroughly defied and dismissed by his former victim in front of his men was an intolerable insult. "Seize her," he shrieked, his composure shattering. The knights hesitated, their eyes on the still, silent form of the vampire king. But one, loyal to a fault, spurred his horse forward, his lance lowered. He never reached her. Valerius moved. He didn't seem to cross the distance. He was simply there. One moment by Linnea's side, the next in front of the charging knight. His hand shot out and caught the lance tip, the iron groaning as his fingers closed around it. With a flick of his wrist, he snapped the thick shaft of wood and iron as if it were a twig. The shadows in the courtyard erupted. They rose from the flagstones, silent, shrieking tendrils of pure night, wrapping around the legs of the horses, pulling knights from their saddles. There were no screams, only the choked gasps of terrified men being overwhelmed by living darkness. Valerius did not draw a weapon. He was the weapon. He moved through them, a blur of controlled, lethal force, disarming and disabling with contemptuous ease. He saved Alaric for last. He cornered the prince against a wall, lifting him from the ground by his throat, the man's feet kicking uselessly in the air. "You put your hands on what is mine," Valerius snarled, his voice a sibilant whisper of death. His fangs, for the first time in her presence, elongated. "You threatened her. For that, you have forfeited your life." "No!" Linnea's voice cut through his rage. He paused, his crimson eyes turning to her. "Don't kill him," she said, walking closer. "Death is too easy. Make him live with what he has done. Send him back broken. Let him be the one to carry the tale of his own foolishness." Valerius stared at her, at the strength and wisdom in her face. She was not asking for mercy for Alaric. She was demanding a more fitting punishment. He saw the strategic brilliance of it. A dead prince was a martyr. A humiliated one was a lesson. He let out a breath, the cold fury receding, replaced by a deep, abiding admiration. He threw Alaric to the ground at her feet. The prince coughed and sputtered, staring up at her with terror and disbelief. "You heard the lady of this castle," Valerius said, his voice returning to its cold, commanding tone. "Go, and tell your king that the next time anyone from his sun-drenched land crosses my border with ill intent, I will blot out his sky for 1,000 years." The prince and his battered knights scrambled away, fleeing into the twilight, pursued by the echoes of their own failure. Linnea stood in the silent courtyard, the shadows receding back to the corners, Valerius at her side. She had faced her tormentor and won. She had not been a prize to be fought over. She had been a power in her own right. He turned to her, his expression unreadable but for the fierce light in his eyes. "The lady of this castle," he repeated softly. "It suits you." The official delegation arrived 2 weeks later. This time they came with gifts and tribute, their banners lowered in supplication. King Theron himself led them, his face pale and drawn. Prince Alaric was with them, his arm in a sling, his eyes downcast, the specter of his humiliation clinging to him like a shroud. They came to formally sue for peace and ratify the treaty Valerius had dictated. The ceremony was held in Nocturne's great hall, a cavernous space of black marble and glowing crystal chandeliers. Valerius sat not on a throne of conquest, but in a simple high-backed chair of dark wood at the head of a long table. And beside him, in a chair of equal stature, sat Linnea. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the color of the nocturne sky. It was simple, elegant, and she felt a sense of belonging she had never known. She was nervous, but when she felt Valerius's cool fingers briefly brush hers under the table, a wave of calm settled over her. King Theron read the treaty's terms aloud, his voice trembling slightly. His kingdom would cede the contested borderlands, pay an annual tribute in grain and steel, and formally recognize the sovereignty of Nocturne. In return, the Shadow King would maintain his protective shield against the eastern hordes. When the reading was done, Valerius stood. His voice filled the hall, imbued with an authority that was absolute. "These terms are acceptable," he declared, "but they are incomplete. The treaty was predicated on an exchange. My protection for one of your subjects. That subject is owed a debt by your court, a debt of honor." He looked directly at King Theron, then his gaze shifted to pin Prince Alaric to his spot. "You dismissed her. You shamed her. You called her work a fantasy. Yet that fantasy is the very thing that now allows my kingdom to heal, and in turn allows me the strength to protect yours. You did not give me a mere archivist. You gave me the heart of the North." He turned to Linnea, and his expression softened in a way that made the entire hall hold its breath. He took a heavy cloak from the back of his chair. It was magnificent, woven from a material that seemed to be spun from shadow and starlight, embroidered with the silver constellations of the northern sky. He draped it over her shoulders. It was warm, alive with his power and his regard. "I name you Linnea, first cartographer of Nocturne," he announced, his voice ringing with pride. "Counsel to the throne, lady of this castle." He then looked back at the stunned delegation. "Your prince will now offer his apology." It was the ultimate reversal. Alaric, white-faced and trembling with rage and shame, was forced to step forward. He had to bow low before the woman he had ridiculed. In front of both courts, he had to speak the words. "I was wrong," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Your work is true. I apologize, my lady." Linnea looked down at him, not with triumph, but with a cool, distant pity. He was small, his opinion no longer mattered. She simply nodded, a gesture of regal dismissal. Her old wound was not just healed, it was gone, leaving behind a scar of diamond-hard strength. Valerius let the moment hang in the air, a final crushing weight on Alaric's pride. Then he addressed King Theron again. One final matter. An alliance between our houses must be formalized, not as a matter of politics, but as a matter of the heart. He turned fully to Linnea, sinking to one knee before her. The entire assembly gasped. The ancient, immortal vampire king, the terror of the world, was kneeling. He took her hand, his cool touch of familiar comfort. His crimson eyes, blazing with an emotion that was raw and deeply vulnerable, met hers. Linnea, you came into my world of silence and shadow and brought with you the fire of life. You saw not a monster, but a lonely king. You healed not just my land, but my soul. I ask you not as a king to a subject, but as a man to the woman he loves. Will you be my wife, my queen? Tears welled in Linnea's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She, the overlooked archivist, the fanciful spinster, had been seen so completely and valued so deeply that it had remade her world and his. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Valerius, I will. He rose, and with a tenderness that defied his fearsome reputation, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire and passion, but of deep, reverent gratitude, a kiss that tasted of winter and starlight, a promise of a shared eternity in their beautiful healing twilight. 5 years passed. The twilight of Nocturne was no longer a sign of decay, but a gentle, permanent gloaming, soft and peaceful. Patches of moss, glowing with a soft silver light, now carpeted the forest floors. In the ghost rivers Linnea had mapped, had begun to flow again, their waters clear and cold. The kingdom was breathing once more. Linnea and Valerius stood in the great library, the heart of their home. The great map was complete, framed and hanging on the wall, a testament to their shared work. She was tracing the lines of a new project, a celestial chart, her fingers smudged with silver ink. Valerius stood behind her, his arms wrapped loosely around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood like this often, in comfortable, contented silence. The castle was no longer lonely. It was filled with the quiet hum of their shared life. He watched her hand move across the parchment, her touch still as sure and sensitive as the day she had first touched his throne. Her hair was starting to show, a few faint threads of silver at the temples. The sight sent a familiar gentle ache through his still heart. Linnea, he said softly, his voice a low vibration against her back. She murmured, not looking up from her work. We have never spoken of it, he began, choosing his words with care. Of time. It moves differently for me. She stopped drawing and placed her hand over his where they rested on her waist. She knew what he was asking, the unspoken question that had hung in the air between them for years. She turned in his arms to face him, her warm, living hands coming up to frame his cool, perfect face. She looked into his crimson eyes, which held none of the old sorrow, only a deep, unwavering love for her. I know, she said, and I am not afraid of it. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I can offer it to you, he whispered. Eternity, 1,000 years of nights like this, but I will never demand it. The choice must be yours. This life, or 1,000 more with me. She smiled, a slow, gentle curve of her lips. She saw the fear behind his offer, the fear of one day losing her. She leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his lips. Let's finish this map first, she said, her eyes sparkling with a light that was all her own. And then the next one, and the one after that. We have time to talk about forever. He opened his eyes, a wave of relief and adoration washing over him. It was the perfect answer. She was not grasping for immortality. She was living in their now, cherishing the life they had built. The choice was a conversation for another day, not a condition of their love. Her value to him was not in her potential for eternity, but in the precious, brilliant truth of who she was right now. He tightened his embrace, holding her as if she were the most priceless treasure in the world, which of course she was. As my queen commands, he murmured against her hair, and in the quiet of their library, surrounded by the stories of ages, they began their next chapter, together. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of lonely darkness, and where being seen for your true worth becomes the greatest power of all, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.